The wind changed before anyone noticed the sky had. It came low across the prairie, bending the dry grass in long silver waves, carrying a cold that did not belong to early winter. Folks in town said storms always announced themselves if you listened close enough. That morning, the silence felt louder than thunder. She felt it first while standing behind her small wooden shed, boots pressed into frozen dirt, breath rising like smoke. The land stretched empty in every direction, pale and wide, the kind of emptiness that made a person feel small yet stubborn enough to survive it. A thin line of clouds gathered along the horizon, heavy and unmoving, like cattle refusing to budge. She watched them longer than she meant to, lantern swinging gently from her hand. The prairie had taught her patience, but it had also taught her fear. Winters here were not seasons. They were tests. 3 days earlier, a rider from town had brought word that the worst blizzard in decades was coming. Old-timers compared it to storms they barely survived as children. The general store owner had already boarded his windows. Flour vanished from shelves before noon. Families packed wagons and moved closer together, choosing warmth over pride. But she stayed where she was, as she always had, on land that asked everything from her and gave just enough back to keep hope alive. Her shed stood half buried into a slope behind the house, built by hands long gone. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than a mound of earth. Up close, its wooden doors opened into a hollow space carved carefully into the ground. Cool in summer, safe in winter. The kind of place meant for waiting out hard times. That morning, she carried another sack across the yard, muscles aching but steady. Flour stamped with a faded date brushed against her skirt as she lowered it inside. Rows of glass jars lined the shelves already, glowing amber in lantern light. Tomatoes, beans, peaches, corn. Each one sealed months ago during warm evenings when the air smelled of soil and sweat. Each jar a promise she had made to herself when the first frost touched the fields. She counted everything twice. Then once more. Potatoes filled wooden crates near the back wall. Carrots lay packed in sand. Smoked meat hung from beams overhead, wrapped tight against damp air. Barrels of grain rested beside sacks of dried herbs tied with twine. The scent inside the cellar was rich and honest, earth mixed with salt and smoke. It felt like safety, though she knew safety on the prairie was never permanent. Neighbors had asked why she was storing so much. No family lived with her now, no hired hands came through the gate. She only smiled and said winter was unpredictable. The truth sat heavier than that, resting quietly behind her ribs. The wind pressed harder against the doors as afternoon faded. Snow began as a whisper, fine crystals drifting sideways instead of down. She stepped outside and pulled her shawl tighter, scanning the empty fields. The distant farmhouse to the west looked abandoned already, its chimney dark. Even the animals had gone quiet, tucked away in barns that creaked with every gust. She remembered another winter years ago, one that arrived without warning. Roads vanished overnight. Supplies ran thin. People learned quickly how fragile comfort could be. Some families never fully recovered. Since then, she trusted preparation more than forecasts and silence more than reassurance. She lifted another crate, boots slipping slightly on frost, and lowered it carefully into the cellar. Hundreds of pounds of food rested beneath the shed now, hidden from wind, cold, and wandering eyes. Enough to last months if needed. Enough to outwait whatever came roaring across the plains. Still, unease lingered. The sky darkened too early, turning the prairie blue and gray. Snow thickened, erasing fence lines and paths she could walk blindfolded in summer. The lantern flame flickered as she made one final check, running her hand along the shelves as if greeting old friends. Glass clinked softly under her touch. She hesitated before closing the doors. For a moment she listened. Not to the wind, but beneath it. A faint sound carried across the land, distant and uncertain. It might have been a loose shutter somewhere far off. It might have been an animal crying against the cold. Or something else entirely, something moving through the storm long before anyone expected travelers to be out. She stepped outside and lifted the lantern higher. Snow struck her face sharply now, stinging her eyes. The prairie had disappeared into white motion, horizon swallowed whole. The path to the house was already fading behind her footprints. Again the sound came, clearer this time, not wind, not wood. A knock, slow, heavy, from somewhere beyond the blowing snow. Her heart tightened. No one should have been out there. Not with the blizzard hours away from full strength. She turned toward the dark edge of the property, straining to see through the storm, lantern light trembling in her grip. The knock came once more, closer now, followed by a shape emerging from the white curtain of snow. She froze beside the open cellar doors, the warmth of stored food behind her and the unknown waiting ahead, realizing that whatever had found its way to her lonely prairie home might need shelter just as badly as she did. And the storm had only just begun. The figure stumbled forward against the wind, shoulders hunched, one arm raised to shield a face hidden beneath frost and blowing snow. The lantern light barely reached them, yet she could see enough to know they had been walking a long time. Each step looked heavy, uncertain, as if the prairie itself was trying to pull them down. She did not move right away. Out here, caution kept people alive. The storm muffled sound, turning distance into deception. Anyone could appear harmless until they were not. Still, no traveler crossed open land in weather like this without desperation riding close behind. The knock came again, softer now, not against wood but carried through the air as a weak call. The wind swallowed most of it, leaving only fragments that reached her ears. She tightened her grip on the lantern and stepped forward slowly, boots crunching through fresh snow. The cellar doors remained open behind her, warm light spilling out like an invitation she had not meant to give. For a brief moment she wondered if the stranger had seen it from afar, a glow in the growing storm guiding them here. When the figure finally reached the edge of the yard, they stopped as though unsure they were welcome. Snow clung to their coat in thick layers, and their hat was pulled so low it nearly hid their eyes. One gloved hand trembled. "You came a long way," she said, her voice steady, despite the racing beat in her chest. The stranger nodded but did not speak immediately. Their breath came in sharp bursts, visible between them. Finally, a rough voice answered, thin from cold and exhaustion. "Road's gone, storm's turning early, she already knew that." The sky had warned her hours ago. Still, hearing it spoken aloud made the coming blizzard feel closer, heavier. She studied the horizon again. The clouds had lowered, pressing down on the prairie like a lid closing over a pot. Snow now fell thick enough to blur the outlines of her own barn. If the stranger had arrived 10 minutes later, they might never have found the house at all. "Come inside before you freeze," she said at last. The figure hesitated, glancing past her toward the open cellar. She noticed the movement instantly. Most people would have looked toward the warmth of the house, not the shed buried into the hill. A small warning stirred in her thoughts, quiet but firm. "It's just storage," she added calmly, stepping slightly to block the view. "House is this way." They followed without argument, though their steps dragged as if every ounce of strength had already been spent. Snow erased their tracks almost as quickly as they made them. By the time they reached the porch, the prairie behind them looked untouched again, empty as ever. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and dried sage. She set the lantern on the table and added another log to the stove. Flames rose eagerly, filling the room with heat that felt almost unreal compared to the biting cold outside. The stranger removed their gloves slowly, fingers red and stiff. She poured hot water into a tin cup and handed it over. "Drink first. Talk later." They nodded in thanks, wrapping both hands around the cup as if afraid it might vanish. Steam curled upward between them. For a while, neither spoke. The wind battered the walls, rattling the windows with growing force. Each gust sounded stronger than the last. She watched quietly, taking in small details. The coat was worn but sturdy, the kind used by ranch hands or long-distance riders. Boots were caked with frozen mud from somewhere far beyond her property. A satchel hung across their shoulder, tied shut with careful knots. "You from town?" she asked eventually. A pause followed. "Pass through," came the answer. Not an answer at all, she thought. Outside, the storm deepened, snow striking the windows in steady waves. The blizzard had arrived sooner than predicted, just as she feared. Travel would soon be impossible. Anyone caught outdoors now would have to wait it out wherever they stood. She felt a quiet relief knowing her preparations were finished. Months of work rested safely beneath the shed. Enough preserved food, grain supplies, and root vegetables to survive isolation if roads stayed buried for weeks. The prairie demanded readiness, and she had listened. Yet unease crept in again when she noticed the stranger's gaze drifting around the cabin, measuring shelves, counting supplies without seeming to. It was a habit she recognized. People who traveled hard country learned to notice resources quickly. "You live out here alone?" they asked. The question landed heavier than expected. Yes. Another silence followed, longer this time. The wind roared like a passing train, shaking loose snow from the roof. Somewhere outside, a loose board struck repeatedly against the barn wall. She remembered how neighbors once warned her that isolation carried risks beyond weather. The prairie attracted wanderers, honest and otherwise. Still, turning someone away during a storm meant certain death. No one who respected the land ignored that rule. She sat across from them, hands folded loosely in her lap. "Storm will last a while," she said. "Best settle in." The stranger nodded again, though something restless lingered behind their eyes. They reached toward the satchel as if to check its contents, then stopped when they realized she noticed. Another gust slammed against the cabin, stronger than before. Snow forced its way through tiny cracks around the window frame, dusting the sill in white powder. The blizzard was building fast now, swallowing sound and distance alike. Then, through the howl of wind, came another noise, not from outside, from beneath the floorboards. A faint thud echoed upward, followed by the unmistakable clink of glass shifting somewhere below the house, deep underground where her carefully buried food storage lay hidden. She felt the blood drain from her face. The stranger heard it too. Their head lifted slowly, eyes sharpening as both of them turned toward the same spot on the floor, listening as the sound came again, louder this time, as though something or someone had moved inside the cellar she had sealed only moments before. The sound came again, a dull scrape followed by the faint rattle of glass. It was unmistakable now. Something had shifted inside the underground cellar beneath the shed, the very place she had secured only minutes earlier. Her breath slowed, not from calm but from careful control. Panic wasted energy, and the prairie punished wasted energy. The stranger set the tin cup down slowly. The warmth that had softened their shoulders vanished, replaced by alert stillness. "You expecting anyone else?" they asked. "No," she said, perhaps too quickly. The wind howled harder outside, pressing against the cabin walls as if trying to listen with them. Snow slid off the roof in heavy sheets. The storm had fully arrived, sealing the prairie in white isolation. Whatever waited beneath the floor was now trapped here with them. She stood and reached for the lantern again. The flame trembled slightly as she lifted it, shadows stretching across the wooden walls. Every step toward the door felt heavier than the last. Behind her, she sensed the stranger rise as well. "You should stay," she said without turning. A pause followed. "If something's down there," the stranger replied carefully, "you might need another pair of hands." She hesitated. Trust did not come easily out here. Yet fear of the unknown pressed harder than suspicion. After a moment, she nodded once and opened the door. The storm struck instantly, wind forcing snow into the cabin before she pushed her way outside. The path to the shed had nearly vanished already. Lantern light struggled against the blowing white, revealing only fragments of ground ahead. Each step felt like walking into moving clouds. Her mind raced through possibilities: a loose shelf, a fallen jar. Maybe shifting frost had cracked the soil above the cellar roof. She clung to ordinary explanations, though none settled her unease. She knew every inch of that storage space. Nothing moved there unless touched. The shed doors stood exactly where she had left them, half buried now beneath drifting snow. No footprints surrounded them except her own and the stranger's fading tracks. The prairie beyond remained empty, swallowed by storm. She brushed snow from the wooden handles and listened. For a moment there was nothing but wind. Then, faintly, another scrape echoed from below, followed by a soft thump that vibrated through the ground.